Marple and Secret on the Terrace.
Chapter 1. The Fall at Elmwood House. The morning in St. Mary Mead unfolded with a quiet grace that seemed untouched by the world beyond its hedgerows. A gentle sunlight rested upon the narrow lanes, warming the frost that still lingered upon the grass, while the air carried a faint scent of damp earth and early blossoms. It was the sort of morning that encouraged reflection rather than haste. Miss Marple, wrapped in her familiar grey shawl, stepped out of her modest cottage and began her walk toward Elmwood House. Her pace was unhurried, as was her habit, for she believed that much could be observed in the small details others were too busy to notice. Along the way, she greeted a passing villager with a polite nod and paused briefly to examine a cluster of budding flowers, as though committing their quiet beauty to memory. Elmwood House stood at the far end of a curved lane, partially hidden behind tall hedges and old trees whose branches stretched protectively around it. The house itself rose to 4 floors, its aged stone walls softened by ivy that clung stubbornly to its surface. There was something dignified about the place, though Miss Marple could not help but feel that its charm carried a faint hint of unease, as though the house kept its own counsel. Mrs. Beatrice greeted her at the door with evident warmth. "Jane, my dear," she said, her voice bright with affection. "It has been far too long. You haven't changed at all." Miss Marple smiled gently. "My dear Beatrice, one does one's best." She stepped inside, removing her gloves as she entered the drawing room, where the tea gathering was already underway. The room was tastefully arranged, filled with polished furniture and delicate ornaments that spoke of careful upkeep. A soft fire burned in the hearth, adding both warmth and a sense of comfort. The guests were assembled with a certain formality. Mr. Alfred, Beatrice's husband, stood near the fireplace, his expression reserved but polite. Their son Richard appeared restless, his attention shifting frequently toward the window. Beside him sat his wife, Evelyn, whose appearance suggested the influence of London's more modern sensibilities. Her lace gown was finely tailored, and a subtle fragrance surrounded her, refined yet noticeable. Miss Marple's observant gaze lingered briefly upon Evelyn's hands. There, just near the thumb, she noticed a small burn mark, fresh enough to attract attention, yet clearly being concealed with care. The detail registered quietly in her mind, though she made no immediate remark. Beatrice, meanwhile, busied herself arranging the tea service. "Richard and Evelyn have come down for a short visit," she said cheerfully. "London has quite changed them both, I think." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Yes," she replied softly. "The winds of change have a way of reaching even the most settled lives." Richard rose rather abruptly from his seat. "I think I shall step outside for a moment," he said, his tone casual but his expression strained. No one questioned him, though Miss Marple noted the slight tension in his voice. But Margaret, Beatrice's daughter, moved toward the piano soon after. She began to play, though the melody lacked its expected harmony. The notes seemed hesitant, uneven, as though her thoughts were elsewhere entirely. Beatrice leaned closer to Miss Marple, lowering her voice. "Richard was on the terrace very late last night," she confided. "He had quite a bit to drink. I cannot say I approve of such habits. Since returning from London, he has changed." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly, her gaze drifting toward the large window that overlooked the terrace. The sky beyond had begun to soften into the pale gold of late afternoon, though a noticeable chill had entered the air. The wind stirred the branches of the nearby trees, causing them to sway with a restless energy. There was, Miss Marple thought, a certain disquiet beneath the surface of the gathering, something not easily defined, yet quietly persistent. She was just lifting her teacup once more when the calm was shattered. A sharp, piercing scream rang through the house, but the sound was so sudden, so filled with alarm, that it seemed to freeze everyone in place for a single breathless moment. Then the maid, Annie, burst into the room, her face pale and her voice trembling. "Madam, Mr. Richard, he has fallen from the terrace." For a moment, no one moved. Then Beatrice let out a cry of horror, her composure breaking entirely. "Oh God, Richard!" The room descended into confusion as chairs were pushed aside and voices overlapped in panic. Alfred moved quickly to support his wife, while Margaret stood frozen near the piano, her hands trembling. Miss Marple, however, rose with quiet steadiness. There was no outward sign of alarm in her manner, though her eyes had sharpened with sudden focus. Without haste, yet without delay, she followed the others toward the back of the house. Outside, the wind had grown stronger, carrying with it a chill that seemed to settle upon the gathering crowd. The garden, so peaceful only moments before, now felt strangely altered, as though it had become the stage for something far more serious than a simple accident. As Miss Marple approached the scene, she did not rush forward. Instead, she paused briefly, her gaze taking in not only the figure lying below, but the terrace above, the position of the surrounding objects and the expressions upon the faces of those gathered nearby. For Miss Marple had long ago learned one simple truth, that in moments of sudden tragedy it was not only what had happened that mattered, but how and why it had come to pass. And already, though no words had yet been spoken, she felt quite certain of one thing. There was more to this fall than met the eye. Chapter 2. The Terrace Above. The garden behind Elmwood House, so recently calm, had fallen into a state of anxious confusion. Servants whispered in low voices while the family stood in a tight, uncertain cluster. At the centre of it all lay Richard, his body still upon the cold ground where he had fallen. The wind moved steadily through the trees, carrying with it the faint rustle of leaves, yet the sound seemed strangely distant against the weight of what had occurred. Beatrice knelt beside her son, her grief unrestrained, while Alfred remained close at her side, offering what comfort he could. Margaret stood a little apart, her face pale, her hands clasped tightly together. Evelyn, though outwardly composed, seemed withdrawn into herself, her gaze fixed upon the ground rather than the scene before her. And Miss Marple did not immediately approach the body. Instead, she allowed her eyes to travel quietly across the garden. The angle of the fall, the position of the terrace above, the arrangement of the flower beds, each detail held its own quiet importance. In such moments, she knew, it was often the smallest observation that proved the most telling. The distant sound of approaching wheels broke the uneasy silence. The ambulance arrived first, followed closely by the police. The inspector stepped out with a composed efficiency that suggested long familiarity with such scenes. He was a tall man, deliberate in his movements, his expression calm but attentive. After a brief exchange with the attendants, he began his initial examination. "It appears," he said after a moment, "that Mr. Richard has suffered a fall from the terrace, whether accidental or otherwise remains to be seen." There was a slight pause before he added, "In some cases, such incidents may also suggest a deliberate act." Beatrice looked up sharply, her voice trembling. "No, no." "How, that cannot be so." The inspector inclined his head politely. "Yet we shall determine the truth, madam." Miss Marple, who had been standing quietly to one side, now spoke in her gentle, measured tone. "It is very often the case, Inspector, that such situations appear straightforward at first glance, yet they do not always remain so." The inspector regarded her with a thoughtful expression. You believe there may be more to it? Miss Marple offered a small, polite smile. I believe only that it is wise to observe carefully. The inspector nodded. Then we shall begin with the terrace. They entered the house once more and made their way toward the narrow staircase that led upward. The wood creaked faintly beneath their steps, and the air seemed cooler as they ascended. At the top, the terrace door stood slightly ajar, moving gently with the wind. The terrace itself was exposed to the elements, the evening air moving sharply across its surface. A small table lay overturned near the center, while a chair had fallen upon its side. Nothing appeared violently disturbed, yet there was a subtle disarray that suggested something had not been entirely as it should. The inspector stepped forward, his eyes scanning the area carefully. Curious, he murmured. Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her gaze lowering toward the ground near the railing. There, faint but unmistakable, was a small patch of oil. The inspector noticed it almost at the same moment. Oil on a terrace, he said, bending slightly to examine it. That is most unusual. Miss Marple moved closer, her attention now shifting to the railing itself. The paint upon it appeared fresh, too fresh perhaps. It still held a slight tackiness, as though it had not fully dried. There has been recent work done here, she observed quietly. The inspector touched the surface lightly. Yes, quite recent. Miss Marple's eyes lingered upon the railing a moment longer. There were faint marks upon it, not clearly defined, yet suggestive of contact. They did not resemble the firm grip of a man, nor the broad impression of a struggle. Instead, and they seemed lighter, less certain. No one, she said thoughtfully, would willingly place oil near a place where they stand regularly, unless they intended a particular result. The inspector straightened, his expression sharpening. You believe the fall may have been caused deliberately? Miss Marple did not answer directly. I believe, Inspector, that when something appears out of place, it rarely arrives there by chance. He glanced once more around the terrace. There are no clear signs of a struggle, he said, no broken objects beyond what one might expect from a fall. Miss Marple gave a small nod. Indeed, which in itself is rather interesting. For the absence of struggle, she knew, could sometimes suggest not peace, but preparation. The wind rose again, pressing lightly against the terrace door. Beyond the railing, the garden stretched below, its shadows now lengthening with the approach of evening. The inspector turned toward the stairs. We shall have the body examined immediately, he said. Not with the post-mortem may provide further clarity. They descended in silence. Back in the drawing room, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to something quieter, yet no less heavy. The weight of uncertainty now settled over the household. The inspector addressed those present with quiet authority. I shall need to speak with each of you in turn, he said. No detail is too small to be of importance. Miss Marple resumed her seat in a nearby chair, her knitting resting untouched in her lap. Outwardly she appeared calm, merely an elderly lady observing events with mild interest. Yet behind her gentle expression, her thoughts were already taking shape. For she had noticed the oil, she had noticed the railing, and most importantly of all, she had noticed that something within this house did not quite belong. And in her long experience, such small irregularities had a way of leading, quite inevitably, to the truth. Chapter 3. Quiet Questions. The drawing room of Elmwood House had taken on a different character altogether. Where there had once been warmth and polite conversation, there was now a strained stillness, as though the very walls had absorbed the shock of the previous evening and were unwilling to release it. The curtains were partially drawn, muting the daylight, and the fire, though still burning, offered little comfort. Each member of the household seemed enclosed within their own thoughts, speaking only when required. Inspector Mallory, who had introduced himself more formally upon returning indoors, conducted the questioning with calm efficiency. He preferred order, and though the circumstances were unsettling, he approached them with a steady, methodical patience. Miss Marple sat quietly to one side, at her hands folded gently in her lap. She did not interrupt, nor did she appear to be paying particular attention. Yet nothing escaped her notice. The maid, Annie, was the first to be called. She entered hesitantly, her hands clasped together, her expression anxious. There was a tremor in her voice when she spoke. "I was in the kitchen, sir," she said, "preparing the evening tea. I heard the scream. And when I came out, Mr. Richard was already lying in the garden." Inspector Mallory regarded her steadily. "You did not go to the terrace at any point?" "No, sir," Annie replied quickly. "Everyone was inside." Miss Marple's eyes drifted downward, quite naturally, to Annie's shoes. They were practical, worn slightly at the edges, and marked with a faint layer of garden soil. Her gaze rose again, calm and thoughtful. "How curious," she said gently, as though remarking upon something trivial. "If you were in the kitchen, my dear, how did your shoes come to be so outdoors in appearance?" Annie blinked, clearly unsettled by the question. I went outside afterwards, madam," she said, after a brief pause, "when I heard what had happened." Miss Marple inclined her head, accepting the explanation without comment. Yet the faint hesitation had not gone unnoticed. Inspector Mallory made a note before dismissing her. Evelyn was called next. She entered with a composed air, though her movements were slower than before. As she approached, there was a slight unevenness in her step, a subtle limp that might have escaped a less attentive observer. Miss Marple rose slightly in her chair. "My dear Mrs. Evelyn," she said kindly, "I trust you are not in discomfort. You seem to favour one foot." Evelyn offered a small, controlled smile. "It is nothing of consequence. I turned my ankle yesterday. These shoes are not particularly forgiving." Miss Marple's gaze rested briefly upon her ankle. There was indeed a faint mark, just visible above the edge of her shoe. "How unfortunate," Miss Marple murmured. Inspector Mallory began his questioning. "Where were you at the time of the incident?" "In the drawing room," Evelyn replied, "with the others." "You did not go to the terrace?" "No." Her answers were measured, neither hurried nor overly cautious. Yet there was something in the tone, a certain carefulness, that Miss Marple found interesting. Evelyn was dismissed. Margaret followed. She seemed deeply unsettled, her hands twisting together as she spoke. "I was playing the piano," she said. "I did not notice anything unusual until the scream." Her voice faltered slightly. Inspector Mallory watched her closely. "Did your brother appear distressed earlier in the evening?" Margaret hesitated. "He has not been himself since returning from London." "Can you be more specific?" She shook her head. "I cannot say exactly. Only that he seemed troubled." There was sincerity in her distress, though Miss Marple noted that Margaret's eyes had briefly flickered toward the window at the mention of the terrace. A small detail, but one worth remembering. Alfred was the last to be questioned. His manner was controlled, his tone steady. "I was here, in this very room," he said. "I heard the scream and went outside at once." "Did you observe anything unusual about your son's behaviour?" Alfred paused. He had been drinking more than usual, he admitted. And he kept to himself. I assumed it was a passing mood. Inspector Mallory closed his notebook. "That will be all, for now." One by one they were dismissed, leaving the drawing room quieter than before. Miss Marple remained seated, her expression thoughtful. After a moment, she spoke softly. "Inspector, there are two small matters that trouble me." Mallory turned toward her with interest. "Go on." "The maid's shoes," Miss Marple said. "They suggest a visit to the garden earlier than she claims. And Mrs. Evelyn's ankle, injured, she says, by chance." The inspector considered this. "You believe they are connected?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I believe, Inspector, that when two small irregularities appear together, they are seldom unrelated." Mallory nodded slowly. "Then tomorrow we shall examine the servants' quarters. It may clarify matters." Miss Marple rose, on taking up her knitting at last. As she moved toward the door, her gaze passed briefly over the remaining members of the household. Evelyn stood near Beatrice, offering quiet comfort. Margaret lingered by the piano, her hands resting lightly upon the keys, though she did not play. Alfred remained near the fireplace, his expression unreadable. Each appeared exactly as one might expect. And yet, Miss Marple paused for the briefest of moments, for she had long ago learned that in households such as this, truth was rarely hidden in grand gestures. It revealed itself instead in the smallest inconsistencies, a pair of muddy shoes, a turned ankle, a moment's hesitation. And somewhere, within those quiet details, the truth was waiting to be found. Chapter 4. The Servants' Wing. The following morning arrived beneath a pale veil of mist that clung to the grounds of Elmwood House. The air was cool and damp, carrying with it the stillness that often follows a night of uneasy thoughts. The house itself seemed quieter than before, as though it, too, had withdrawn into silence. Inspector Mallory met Miss Marple near the rear corridor, where the grander parts of the house gave way to simpler, more functional spaces. The servants' wing lay beyond, a narrower passage, less adorned, where the walls bore fewer decorations and the light entered only sparingly through small windows. "There is often more truth to be found here," the inspector remarked, "than in the drawing room." Miss Marple gave a slight nod. "Yes, indeed. It is in such places that habits are least disguised." They proceeded along the corridor, their footsteps softened by the worn carpeting. The atmosphere felt different here, less composed, more revealing. Doors stood slightly ajar, and the faint scent of oil, soap, and earth lingered in the air. Annie's room lay at the far end. It was modest in its arrangement, a narrow bed, a small table, and a wooden trunk placed neatly in the corner. Everything appeared in order, though the simplicity of the room seemed at odds with the unease that had settled upon its occupant. Annie stood near the doorway, her hands tightly clasped. "Open the trunk, please," Inspector Mallory said. She hesitated for a moment. "There are only clothes, sir." "Then there is no harm in showing them." With a reluctant movement, Annie knelt and lifted the lid. At first glance, the contents appeared exactly as she had described, neatly folded garments arranged with care. But as the inspector moved aside the upper layers, something else came into view. A small bottle. It lay partially concealed beneath the clothing, its glass surface dull but unmistakable. When lifted, a faint, sharp scent rose from it. "Machine oil," the inspector said, examining the label. "The same as that found on the terrace." Miss Marple stepped closer, her gaze thoughtful. "For garden tools," she added quietly. At that moment, a figure appeared in the doorway. It was Tom, the gardener, a young man of reserved manner whose quiet presence had thus far attracted little attention. His expression shifted the moment he saw the bottle. "That belongs to me, sir," he said quickly. "I must have misplaced it." Annie may have taken it by mistake. Annie shook her head at once. No, sir. I found it near Mr. Richards' room yesterday. I did not know what it was, so I kept it. Miss Marple watched them both with quiet interest. Annie's face had grown noticeably pale, her voice strained. Tom, meanwhile, avoided meeting their eyes, his posture slightly rigid. Inspector Mallory's tone became firmer. It would appear, he said, that both of you have some explaining to do. Tom shifted his weight before speaking again. I was on the terrace a few days ago, he said. The railing had been repainted. I was asked to look over it, make sure everything was in order. Miss Marple's attention sharpened. You were responsible for the railing? She asked gently. Yes, madam. I finished the work recently. And while you were there, she continued, did you notice anything out of the ordinary? Tom hesitated, as though searching his memory. There was a sound, he said at last. A sort of clicking, like footsteps. Heels, perhaps. Inspector Mallory glanced toward Annie. You wear heeled shoes, do you not? Annie nodded quickly. Yes, sir. Miss Marple spoke softly, almost to herself. Indeed, but then, so do others in this house. There was a brief silence. The small room seemed suddenly narrower, the air heavier. The inspector turned the bottle in his hand, his expression thoughtful. This places both of you in a position of interest, he said. The oil, the terrace, the timing, none of it may be dismissed lightly. Annie lowered her gaze, her hands trembling slightly. Tom remained still, though the tension in his posture had not eased. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes moving once more around the room. Everything appeared ordinary, and yet the presence of the oil in Annie's trunk, Tom's connection to the railing, the sound of heels upon the terrace. Each detail taken alone might have seemed insignificant. Together, however, they suggested something far more deliberate. Miss Marple folded her hands quietly before her. It is often the case, she said gently, that objects travel where they do not belong, for a reason. Inspector Mallory nodded slowly. And it is our task, he replied, to discover what that reason may be. As they left the servants' wing, the mist outside had begun to lift, though the clarity it brought did not extend to the mystery within the house, for if anything, the truth had only grown more carefully concealed. Chapter 5. Beneath the Oak Tree. 2 days passed, and with them came a quiet heaviness that settled deeply over Elmwood House. The earlier confusion had given way to a more subdued stillness, one shaped not by shock, but by grief. Even the air itself seemed softened, as though unwilling to disturb the solemn mood that had taken hold. That morning, the funeral was held beneath the great oak tree that stood at the front of the house, its wide branches stretched outward, casting a gentle shade over the gathering below. White lilies and sprigs of lavender had been arranged with care around the wooden coffin, their fragrance drifting faintly through the cool air. Miss Marple stood slightly apart from the others, her grey shawl drawn closely about her shoulders. Her expression was composed, and though her eyes moved quietly from one face to another, observing without intrusion. Beatrice stood nearest to the coffin, her grief unhidden. There was a fragile quality to her now, as though the weight of loss had settled too heavily upon her spirit. Alfred remained beside her, his silence firm, though there was something restrained in his manner, an emotion held carefully in check. Margaret stood a short distance away, her hands clasped together, her gaze lowered. From time to time she glanced toward the house, as though seeking something she could not name. Evelyn stood among them, dressed in black, her posture calm and dignified. Tears rested lightly upon her cheeks, though they did not fall freely. There was, Miss Marple thought, a certain control in her grief, neither exaggerated nor entirely natural. The ceremony itself was simple, conducted with quiet respect. Words were spoken, though Miss Marple paid little attention to them. It was not words in her experience that revealed truth, but the manner in which people listened to them. As the final moments passed and the gathering began to disperse, a new figure arrived, Miss Rose. She approached with a composed confidence, her appearance neat, or her expression observant. There was something sharp about her features, something that suggested a habit of noticing more than she chose to say. She moved directly toward Evelyn, embracing her with familiarity. "My dear Evelyn," she said softly, "I came as soon as I heard." Evelyn returned the gesture, though Miss Marple observed that her gaze, for the briefest moment, shifted beyond her friend to herself. It was a small glance, yet Miss Marple did not overlook such things. Later, the household gathered once more in the drawing room. Tea was served, though few appeared inclined to drink it. The room, once filled with polite conversation, now held only quiet murmurs and the faint clink of porcelain. Inspector Mallory stood near the fireplace, speaking in a low voice. "The post-mortem report has arrived," he said. "There was alcohol in Mr. Richard's system, as expected. However, there was also a small quantity of a sedative present." A silence followed. Beatrice looked up sharply, her expression troubled. "A sedative?" she repeated. "Yes," the inspector replied. "Not enough to be immediately apparent, but sufficient to weaken." Miss Marple inclined her head slightly. "Then the fall was not the only cause of his helplessness," she said gently. He had been rendered less capable of resisting whatever occurred. The inspector nodded. That would appear to be the case. Miss Marple's gaze moved once more across the room. "In such circumstances," she continued thoughtfully, "one often finds that the person responsible is not a stranger, but someone close, someone who understands the habits of the victim." Her words settled quietly in the room, carrying with them an unspoken implication. Margaret shifted slightly in her seat. Alfred's expression remained composed, though his eyes lowered briefly. Evelyn did not move. Miss Rose, however, watched the exchange with a faint intensity, her attention passing between Miss Marple and the others with quiet interest. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, the only sound that broke the stillness. Miss Marple took a small sip of her tea before setting the cup aside. The pieces of the puzzle, she knew, were beginning to take shape. The oil upon the terrace, the mark upon the railing, the sound of heels in the night, and now the presence of a sedative. Each detail on its own was merely suggestive. Together they formed something more, something deliberate. Miss Marple folded her hands gently in her lap. "For when a person is weakened before a fall," she said quietly, "it is seldom the fall alone that must be considered." Inspector Mallory glanced toward her. "You believe the act was planned?" Miss Marple offered a faint, knowing smile. "I believe, Inspector," she replied, "that we are no longer dealing with chance." And as the afternoon light faded slowly beyond the windows, Elmwood House seemed to draw further into itself, holding its secrets with quiet determination. But Miss Marple, patient as ever, had already begun to see the pattern emerging. And she knew it would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 6. The Room of Quiet Clues. The following morning arrived with a pale and uncertain light filtering gently through the tall windows of Elmwood House. The house itself remained subdued, as though still wrapped in the shadow of recent events. Conversations were brief, footsteps softened, and even the ticking of the clock seemed more pronounced in the silence. Inspector Mallory met Miss Marple near the staircase. "I believe it is time we examine Mr. Richard's room more thoroughly," he said. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, Inspector. Rooms, like people, often reveal more than they intend." They made their way upstairs, their steps measured and quiet. Richard's room was situated at the far end of the corridor, slightly removed from the others. The door stood open, as though inviting inspection, or perhaps unable to conceal what it held. Inside, the air carried a faint mixture of scents, lemon polish, stale cigarette smoke, and something subtler, less easily defined. The curtains were drawn halfway, allowing a thin line of light to stretch across the floor. Miss Marple paused just inside the doorway, allowing her eyes to adjust, her attention already beginning its quiet work. Inspector Mallory stepped forward first, his gaze moving methodically across the room. "Let us see what remains," he said. Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she began her slow and deliberate examination. Her attention was first drawn to the dressing table. There, among the neatly arranged items, stood a perfume bottle, elegant, half empty, and placed with a care that suggested regular use. Yet something about it felt out of place. She moved closer. Curious?" she murmured softly. Inspector Mallory turned. "What is it?" Miss Marple lifted the bottle slightly, holding it near the light. Along its smooth surface, faint but unmistakable, were small traces of paint, thin streaks that had not been entirely removed. "This," she said gently, "has been handled by someone whose hands were not entirely clean." The inspector's expression sharpened. "Paint," he observed. "From the terrace railing, perhaps?" Miss Marple set the bottle back in its place. "Perhaps," she agreed, "though one must always consider who handled it, and when." Her gaze moved next toward the writing desk. The surface appeared orderly, yet something beneath it caught her attention. She bent slightly, retrieving a crumpled piece of paper that had been partially concealed. The edges were darkened, as though it had been burned in haste. Inspector Mallory stepped closer as she unfolded it carefully. Though damaged, a few words remained legible. "If he discovers the truth, everything will end. Tonight, on the terrace." The inspector looked up at once. "The terrace again," he said. "It cannot be coincidence." Miss Marple held the paper a moment longer, her expression thoughtful. "Burned," she said quietly, "but not completely destroyed. That too is often telling." "For what reason?" the inspector asked. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Because when one attempts to hide the truth, one does not always succeed." She folded the letter gently and placed it upon the desk. The final detail revealed itself almost by chance. As Miss Marple turned toward the wardrobe, something within caught her eye, a small disturbance among the otherwise orderly arrangement of clothes. She parted them slightly. There, upon the inner floor of the wardrobe, was a faint mark, a footprint, small, delicate, and edged with dried garden soil. Inspector Mallory crouched beside her. "That is not the maid's," he said at once. "It is smaller." "Yes," Miss Marple replied softly, "and softer too, a different kind of shoe." She rose slowly, her gaze now moving across the room as a whole. The perfume, the letter, the footprint, 3 separate details, 3 separate moments. And yet, they did not tell separate stories. Inspector Mallory straightened. "What do you make of it, Miss Marple?" She did not answer immediately. Instead, she walked slowly toward the window, allowing the light to fall across her face as she considered. "There are 3 narratives here," she said at last, one carried by scent, one by words, and one by movement. The inspector frowned slightly. "And do they agree?" Miss Marple turned back toward him. "No," she said quietly. They do not, which suggests that one of them, perhaps more, is intended to mislead. The room fell silent once more. Inspector Mallory folded his arms. "You believe someone has attempted to arrange the scene?" Miss Marple gave a small nod. "I believe," she said, "that we are being shown what we are meant to see, while something else remains carefully concealed." She moved once more toward the center of the room, her hands lightly folded. "In a house such as this," she continued gently, "truth is rarely absent. It is merely obscured." The inspector regarded her thoughtfully. "And what, in your opinion, lies behind these details?" Miss Marple's expression softened, though her eyes remained clear. "Not merely the question of how Mr. Richard fell," she said, "but why?" She paused briefly. "For it is not always the act itself that reveals the greatest truth, Inspector, but the reason that compelled it." Outside, the morning light had strengthened, though it did little to dispel the quiet tension that lingered within the room. For here, among the ordinary objects of daily life, something had been disturbed, something carefully arranged, and Miss Marple, patient as ever, had begun to see beyond it. The truth, she knew, was close now. It required only one final connection, and that, she suspected, would soon reveal itself. Chapter 7. The pattern revealed. That night, Elmwood House stood in a hush so complete that even the faintest sound seemed to linger longer than it should. The wind had softened, though a lingering chill remained in the air, brushing lightly against the windows and slipping quietly through the corridors. Most of the household had retired for the evening, or at least they appeared to have done so. Miss Marple, however, was not yet at rest. Wrapped once more in her grey shawl, she moved silently along the upper corridor, a small lantern held carefully in her hand. The light it cast was soft and steady, illuminating the path ahead without disturbing the stillness around her. She paused briefly at the foot of the final staircase, as though listening, not for sound, but for something less tangible. Then, with quiet determination, she began to climb. The terrace door opened easily, yielding to the gentle pressure of her hand. Outside, the night air felt sharper, clearer, as though the events of the past days had settled into something more defined. Miss Marple stepped forward. The terrace lay before her much as it had before, the railing, the open space, the distant view of the garden below. Yet in the stillness of night it seemed different. Stripped of distraction, it offered itself more plainly. She moved toward the railing, her steps slow and deliberate. For a moment, she did nothing at all. Then, placing her lantern aside, she reached out and rested her hand lightly upon the painted surface. The paint, though dry to the touch, still carried the faint suggestion of recent work. Her fingers moved gently along its length, and there, just beneath the smoothness, a trace, a faint residue, grease, not immediately visible, yet unmistakable once felt. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "The same," she murmured to herself. The perfume bottle, the paint, the railing. Each had carried the same quiet signature. She withdrew her hand and stood very still, allowing her thoughts to settle into order. The oil upon the floor had not been placed carelessly. The railing had not been freshly painted without purpose. The letter had not been written without urgency. And the footprint, small, deliberate, had not appeared by chance. Individually, they had suggested confusion. Together, they formed a pattern. Miss Marple picked up her lantern once more. "Not what is seen," she said softly, "but what is intended to be seen." She allowed herself a faint smile. "Yes, that is quite right." By the time morning came, the house was once again assembled in the drawing room, The atmosphere was quieter than before, not merely subdued, but expectant. Word had spread that Miss Marple wished to speak. Inspector Mallory stood near the fireplace, his expression attentive. Beatrice sat close by, her grief now softened into a weary stillness. Alfred remained composed, though distant. Margaret stood near the piano, her posture tense. Annie lingered near the doorway, her eyes lowered. Tom stood further back, silent as ever. Evelyn sat among them, calm, still. Miss Marple rose from her chair. Her manner was gentle, her voice soft. But there was a clarity to it now, a quiet certainty that drew every gaze toward her. "Inspector," she began, "I believe the time has come to understand what truly occurred on the terrace." Mallory inclined his head. "Please continue." Miss Marple stepped slightly forward. "At first, the matter appeared simple, a fall perhaps brought about by carelessness or misfortune. Yet certain details did not sit comfortably within such an explanation." She paused briefly. The oil upon the terrace was not accidental. It had been placed deliberately in a position where it would have its intended effect. The room remained silent. "The railing," she continued, "had been freshly painted, not merely for maintenance, but to obscure the marks left upon it." Inspector Mallory glanced toward her. "And the letter?" he asked. "A warning," Miss Marple replied. Or rather, a consequence. Mr. Richard had discovered something he was not meant to know. The meeting upon the terrace was not by chance, it was arranged. A faint tension moved through the room. Miss Marple's gaze shifted, passing from one face to another. "And then," she said, "there was the sound of heels. Not merely a presence, but a particular one." She turned slightly. "A woman?" she said quietly. Annie looked up at once, startled, but Miss Marple did not look toward her. Instead, her gaze rested upon Evelyn. The stillness deepened. "The perfume," Miss Marple continued, "carried traces of paint. The railing bore the same mark, and the injury to the ankle was not the result of misfortune, but of movement upon a surface made deliberately unstable." Inspector Mallory spoke at last. "You are certain of this?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "I am." There was a long pause. No one spoke. No one moved. Miss Marple's voice, when it came again, was no louder than before, but it carried the full weight of her conclusion. "Mrs. Evelyn," she said gently, "the pattern leads quite unmistakably to you." For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Evelyn did not immediately respond. The silence stretched. Only the faint ticking of the clock broke it. And in that quiet, undeniable stillness, the truth had been spoken. Chapter 8. The Quiet Confession. The morning light entered the drawing room softly, but it did nothing to ease the tension that had settled within it. Every person present seemed aware that something final was about to unfold. Miss Marple's words still lingered in the air. No one spoke. Inspector Mallory stepped forward slightly, his voice calm but carrying quiet authority. "Mrs. Evelyn, you have heard what has been said. Would you care to respond?" There was a long pause. Evelyn did not immediately move. For a moment she remained exactly as she was, still composed, almost detached from the weight of the room around her. Then, slowly, she removed her gloves. The movement was unhurried, deliberate, and as the fabric slipped away, the small burn mark upon her thumb became visible once more. Miss Marple watched her, not with accusation, but with quiet understanding. Evelyn looked at her hand, as though seeing it properly for the first time. Then she lifted her gaze. "Yes," she said. The word was soft, but it carried through the room with absolute clarity. "I will speak." No one interrupted her. Even Beatrice, who had been trembling moments before, seemed unable to move. Evelyn rose to her feet. There was no panic in her expression, no collapse, only a calm that now felt different. Not composed, but resolved. It was not sudden, she began, nor was it thoughtless. Her voice remained steady, though something colder now lay beneath it. Richard had already decided, she continued. He believed I would not notice, that I would remain convenient. A faint, bitter stillness entered her tone. But one notices such things, one always does. Miss Marple did not move. Evelyn's eyes shifted briefly toward the window. I found the letters, she said, and in them, his intention. There was a pause. He was going to leave. The words settled heavily into the room. Beatrice let out a quiet, broken sound, but Evelyn did not look toward her. I did not act in anger, she continued. I acted with clarity. Inspector Mallory spoke quietly. You administered the sedative? Yes. Why? So that he would not resist. The answer came without hesitation. Miss Marple's gaze lowered slightly, not in approval but in understanding of something darker. And the terrace? She asked gently. Evelyn gave a faint nod. I knew his habits. He went there every night. She paused. The oil was placed where it could not be seen, only felt. The room seemed colder now. Then you called him there, the inspector said. Yes. Evelyn's voice softened. For a moment, he trusted me. That was the first crack. Not in her composure, but in something deeper. He did not fall immediately, she said. There was a moment when he realized. Her voice lowered further. But by then, she stopped. No one needed her to finish. Silence filled the room, heavy, unavoidable. Miss Marple spoke at last. You arranged everything, she said quietly. The oil, the bottle, the marks. Evelyn nodded. It was necessary, not defensive, not emotional, simply factual. Inspector Mallory stepped forward. Mrs. Evelyn, you will need to come with me. She did not resist. As she moved toward the door, she paused, not for the inspector, not for the family, but for Miss Marple. Their eyes met. And in that brief moment, something passed between them, not forgiveness, not regret, but recognition of truth, of consequence. Then Evelyn turned away. The door closed softly behind her. No one spoke. The silence that followed was not confusion, it was understanding. Beatrice wept quietly. Margaret stood unmoving. Alfred looked away, as though unable to face what remained. Miss Marple returned to her seat. She picked up her knitting. For a moment, she did not begin. Then, softly, she said, It is always the quiet arrangements that prove the most dangerous. Inspector Mallory glanced toward her. You believe she planned everything from the beginning? Miss Marple shook her head gently. No, she said. She only planned the moment. A pause. Then she added, and that is often enough. The room fell still once more. Outside, the oak tree stood unchanged. The house remained as it always had, but something within it had shifted. And Elmwood House, which had once held quiet comfort, now held something else entirely. The memory of a truth that had been carefully hidden and finally revealed.
Don't forget to subscribe and like. Thank you for watching.